the first substantive video this week focuses on what a mediator is. What precisely is a mediator? If we talk about it in general terms, it's fairly easy to assess, but then I'll give you some specific examples of mediators shortly. But a mediator is pretty straightforward causally, in that we ascribe a causal pathway between an antecedent and a consequence. In this case, what I'm saying is that X causes Y. Now remember that with respect to regression, typically what we say is that we have predictors, a bunch of X's, that predict some criterion or Y's. But for the most part, mediators, the way mediation is described in the literature is that it's an additional variable that adds to a bivariate model. Now, that's not necessarily the case. We can have lots of predictors, and if we did have lots of predictors, we would just put this one as x1, and then we would have x2, and so on and so forth. And each one of these would be independent contributors to y, to our dependent variable. But in this case, what we're interested in doing is assessing whether there's a relationship that is more complicated than just simply using a single predictor to find an outcome. And that more complicated relationship is expressed with instead of having an x2, I'm just going to put m here. Now, m could stand for moderator as well as mediator. But in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explicitly model it as a mediator. And what the mediation process is suggesting is that there is a causal pathway that we call an indirect causal pathway between X and Y. So that means that in order for X to influence Y, and this is a causal process. For X to cause Y, to bring about a change in Y, it must in some way act on this other causal agent before it acts on the outcome. So what does all this say? This says that the causal relationship between X and Y is not as simple as just a direct effect, that there is an interim process. So what this really is unpacking the causal process between X and Y. Now, why is this important? Why would we test for mediation? Well, remember, as I described the role of regression, is we want to describe some sort of causal process or prediction process, and then we want to be able to predict future events. Well, if we have an incomplete prediction model, then what we will have is we'll have an attenuation of our relationships and poor prediction in the future. So if we think of this causal pathway and we want to predict the outcome, the most important thing to then use as a predictor is the most proximal predictor in the causal pathway. So therefore, this mediator becomes the point at which we would like to assess to get the most reliable assessment of the outcome. Now, how is that? I'm going to just erase some of these annotations. Why is that? Well, because X is dependent upon influencing M before it actually influences Y. So therefore, the changes in Y from X are contingent on this relationship right here. So this relationship that I'm going to label A dictates the influence that we should expect on X, from X to Y, but it has to go through M if there's pure mediation. Now, what's pure mediation? Pure mediation is when we have eliminated C altogether. And what we have is we have a pathway that must go through M. So the mediator is a go-between. It's a go-between causally between an antecedent and a consequence, and as we talked about before, a predictor and an outcome or criterion, and that this mediator's role is one of both prediction, so we would use M to predict Y, but it is a contingency, not the contingency that we expected from the moderator, because a moderator influences the relationship between X and Y, but in some ways, the mediator does influence the relationship between X and Y because the X to Y relationship is contingent on the X to M relationship and then the M to Y relationship. So what we're doing is we're unpacking the causal pathway and we're including a relevant variable. In the next video, I'm going to discuss how this is different from moderation. So stay tuned for that.